Contested and brokered conventions, presented by the Citizen Genius Project. Prior to the general election, each political party has a primary process to select one candidate who will represent the party in the general election. Each party officially nominates its candidate at a national convention that is held every 4 years prior to a presidential election. At its convention, the party also conducts other business, such as establishing party rules and agreeing on a platform. Through primary elections, caucuses, and state conventions, delegates are chosen to go to the party's national convention to officially decide who the party's nominee will be. More specifically, each state receives a certain number of delegates, and based on the amount of support each candidate receives in the state's primary election, caucuses, or convention, each candidate is allocated a certain number of those delegates. The Democratic and Republican parties have some delegates that are pledged or bound to a particular candidate based on the results of the primary elections, caucuses, and conventions. These delegates are required to support the candidate they are allocated to. In addition, each party has some delegates that are free to vote as they choose. These are known as superdelegates or unbound delegates. To be inclusive of both parties, I'll use a combination of these terms throughout the video. When the delegates at the National Convention vote, the candidate who receives a majority of votes wins the party's nomination for president. For the last few decades, for both the Democratic and Republican parties, one candidate has won a majority of delegates prior to his party's national convention, making the outcome of the convention a foregone conclusion. However, if no candidate receives a majority of delegates through the primary process, the convention is said to be an open convention because the party's nominee will truly be decided at the convention. There are several reasons why this could happen, such as there being 2 candidates that split the delegate count 50-50, or there being 3 or more candidates that split the delegate count so that no one receives a majority. I'll describe some additional factors in a moment. An open convention can be described as contested or brokered. These terms are not consistently used in the media, but typically a contested convention is defined as either one in which no candidate receives a majority of delegates before the convention, but one candidate wins a majority when the delegates vote on the first ballot of the convention. Or a contested convention is one in which a candidate does have a majority of delegates before the convention, but one or more other candidates intends to challenge him or her anyway. In contrast, a brokered convention is typically defined as one in which a candidate receives the nomination by winning a majority of votes after more than one round of voting by the delegates. Let's examine an open convention in more detail. A contested convention could have multiple situations that lead to one candidate winning the nomination on the first ballot. I'll describe 4 scenarios. First, the superdelegates could decide to all support the same candidate, and this could be enough support to give that candidate a majority. Second, a candidate who dropped out of the race but won some delegates could ask that those delegates be unbound and therefore free to support another candidate. This could give one candidate a majority. Third, a candidate could challenge the credentials of some delegates to try to get them disqualified. The vote to approve the credentials of the delegates occurs before the first ballot to choose the nominee. Therefore, without getting into too much detail, a credentials challenge could reduce the number of delegates one candidate has and possibly reassign delegates. As a result, one candidate may end up with a majority of delegates. Fourth, the party could make a rule change that impacts the outcome. The party's rules governing the primary process are actually just the proposed rules. The delegates vote to approve the final version of the rules before they vote for the presidential nominee. One example of a rule change that could have a big impact is to change the rules so that all delegates are unbound. This could allow some delegates who are allocated for one candidate to vote for another instead. A candidate may then have a majority. Regardless of the exact circumstances, if a nominee is not selected on the first ballot, the delegates continue voting until one candidate receives a majority. The convention is then considered brokered because the major power brokers of the party will attempt to make deals to get the delegates to support a particular candidate. As an extreme example, the Democratic Party's 1924 convention selected a nominee on the 103rd ballot, with a total of 60 candidates receiving votes throughout the process. Currently, for both the Democratic and Republican parties, after the first ballot, most of the delegates become unbound. Once the delegates are unbound, they are free to vote for another candidate, or even someone who wasn't competing for the nomination. Finally, let's examine why delegates may change which candidate they support when they are unbound. Delegates could simply change their minds, particularly if new information about a candidate is presented. As described previously, delegates could be released by their candidate or be persuaded by the party's power brokers. It is also possible that delegates never truly supported the candidate they were allocated to. Here's why. When delegates are selected in primary elections and caucuses, in most states a specific person is not chosen as a delegate, but rather a delegate spot is chosen. In essence, an empty delegate seat is allocated to a candidate. After the primary elections and caucuses, the party holds a district meeting or state convention to choose the person who will fill each delegate seat. The Democratic Party gives the candidates a say in choosing who their delegates will be, but the Republican candidates don't have the same degree of influence. Therefore, a candidate may be assigned a person to be his or her delegate, and yet that delegate may not really support that candidate. When delegates become unbound, there is the potential for delegates to switch their support to another candidate. Whether a convention is contested or brokered, one candidate will eventually win a majority and become the party's nominee for president. This has been a short overview of contested and brokered conventions, presented by the Citizen Genius Project.